Thank you, committee members, for having us here today. So allow me briefly to introduce myself and my colleagues. So my name is Christopher Holt, the representative for the West Bank Protection Consortium, and I'm joined by Simon Randalls in Ramallah, who's the advocacy coordinator for the West Bank Protection Consortium. The consortium is a strategic initiative that was formed in 2015 to prevent the forcible transfer of Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And we primarily program in East Jerusalem, Area C and H2 Hebron, where we identify Palestinians as most vulnerable. We're a consortium of 5 international NGOs supported by 12 donors, including the EU, 10 like-minded EU member states, including Ireland and the United Kingdom. As I mentioned, our primary objective is to prevent the forcible transfer of Palestinians in the West Bank. We respond to incidents of demolitions, set the violence. We also support the resilience of Palestinian communities in Area C through the delivery of basic and social infrastructure, including homes, schools and education facilities, and we provide legal aid as well as humanitarian advocacy. We reach approximately 50,000 Palestinians each year. And I think an important point to note before we get into the substance of the presentation in the context of demolitions and increased demolitions of humanitarian aid, the consortium has provided thousands of structures, including homes and schools since 2015, and 92% of those remain in use and remain with the Palestinian community. So it's still very much an important intervention, and we've been able to protect the investment of donors, including Ireland. So I think to note and to begin with, I think obviously we present here in the context of escalating violence in Gaza, in Israel and throughout the occupied West Bank. I'm sure you're all following very closely. But I think it's also important to note that this violence doesn't occur within a vacuum. It occurs in the context of an occupation that's in its 54th year, and an occupation that's defined by what we often describe as a coercive environment in the West Bank in particular. That is an environment that's defined by repeated violation of Palestinian rights and a lack of accountability for violations of those rights. A key violation that we've seen escalate and repeated over the last 5 years in particular is demolition of Palestinian property. And that is a key element which places this continual pressure on Palestinians to leave their homes, to leave their communities in Area C. We want to focus particularly on 2020 and 2021, because that's where we've seen particularly concerning increases in demolitions. So in 2020, and these figures are based on UN OCHA's database, so UN OCHA with the support of partners like us record every demolition of Palestinian property in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And in 2020, there were 848 Palestinian properties either seized or demolished, which affected over 6,000 Palestinians, including 524 children. That represented a 23% increase in comparison to 2019. Alarmingly, in the first quarter of 2021, those trends have continued to increase. In fact, we've seen a 90% increase in 2021 compared to 2020, and of particular concern, a 108% increase in demolitions of donor-funded structures. Most of those structures are funded by the EU and EU member states. So we've seen a particularly alarming increase in the targeting of humanitarian aid in the West Bank, both for demolitions and confiscations. I think an important point to note, as you'll all be well aware, is this occurs in the context of a COVID-19 pandemic, which is particularly acute in the West Bank. While Israel's vaccination campaign has been quite successful, it's very much in its infancy in the Palestinian territories. So when we see this dramatic increase in demolitions in 2020 and now in 2021, it's really exacerbating the vulnerability of Palestinian communities, exacerbating their vulnerability to COVID-19. when their homes are destroyed and they're forced to crowd into a small number of shelters. They're forced to share facilities like toilets and bathrooms. It really greatly exacerbates the risk and the impact of COVID-19 on these communities. So apart from the fact that it represents a serious violation of international law, that we're particularly concerned there's been no respite, and in fact quite the opposite in demolitions in a time when an already vulnerable community is battling the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the questions often come up when we're engaging with interlocutors and our partners is why we are seeing this dramatic increase. The second highest rate of demolitions in 11 years is what we're seeing this year, and why this year? And I think there are a number of factors that represent possible explanation. One, last year in August, Prime Minister Netanyahu suspended de jure plans to annex further areas of the West Bank. So suspended plans to apply Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank. Now, that upset elements of the pro-settler movement, and it's a reasonable analysis to suggest that part of the reason for the increase in demolitions and settlement expansion is to appease the settler movement following the suspension of annexation. And indeed, that's borne out by discussion in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, when they discuss the need to increase demolitions of Palestinian properties, which are seen by members of the Knesset as illegal Palestinian construction. The other element is the fact that this year we've now seen the fifth Israeli elections in a very short period of time, in 2 years. So part of this increase in demolition is perhaps a reason, perhaps motivation to capitalise votes for the Likud party. Thirdly, there's obviously a new administration in the US. Part of this increase may be testing the position and the resolve of the Biden administration. Israel have been able to quite freely continue with a settlement enterprise, with attempts to expand settlements and increase demolitions during the Trump administration. There is perhaps a moment now where they're testing the resolve of the incoming Democratic administration to see how far they can continue with this expansion. And finally, and by far the most important factor, is the historical absence of accountability. We've seen statements of condemnation, of regret repeatedly by member states, by the EU, in response to violations of international law by Israel, including the demolition of property. But what's glaringly absent are meaningful consequences and indeed the commitment that member states will pursue meaningful consequences where these violations occur, particularly where it involves the destruction of donor-funded aid, including aid funded by the Irish government. One point to note out, because we talked about annexation plans last year and their suspension. I think it's important to note that although de jure, that is annexation at law, is ostensibly suspended, what we're seeing is an acceleration of de facto annexation in fact and in practice. So what you'll see on your screen is a map. The green area is what would be ostensibly a Palestinian state. The white area is areas slated for annexation, both in plans by Prime Minister Netanyahu and in the US Peace to Prosperity plan. Almost exclusively demolitions occur in areas slated for annexation. So that's by no accident. And in fact, 83% of demolitions, based on UN data, occur within 2.5 kilometres of a settlement, and 70% within 1 kilometre. So it's quite clear that demolitions are part of the tools used by Israel to annex Palestinian land and to force Palestinian from areas that Israel want to annex. Just briefly, because we would have obviously loved to be able to host you in the Palestinian territories, but with the current situations, that's not possible. But we just wanted to highlight visually what the settlement enterprise looks like on the ground. So you'll see in this first picture, Ma'ale Adumim, which is an Israeli settlement, an illegal Israeli settlement in the heart of Area C. It's the third largest settlement, and it's considered by many Israelis as a suburb of Jerusalem. And yet clearly under the Oslo Accords and international law, it is an illegal settlement. If you'll see the red circle over the water tower On the next slide, you'll see Abu Nawar, which is a community, a Palestinian Bedouin community in which we work, in which Ireland, the Irish government, funds humanitarian aid. You can see the stark difference. The reason it looks like that is because of the consistent demolitions. Of the 700 Palestinians that live in this community, all their properties are subject to demolition orders. It's very difficult for them to build, to access livelihoods, to access water and resource. So that picture in itself presents a very stark reality of what annexation looks like on the ground. Finally, to conclude, we touched on both repeated violations and the lack of accountability. And what we've done as a consortium is map statements made by the EU, by the External Action Service over the last 3 years. We've mapped 96 statements which really highlight what we would describe as the condemnation approach. We've mapped 8 metrics, which you'll see on the left-hand side, including settlement illegality, opposition to demolitions, forcible transfer or forced transfer. So what we've looked at is the amount of times or the percentage in which statements made by the EU refer to these things. So in 2017, we saw that about 74% of settlements of statements referred to settlement illegality, 43% referred to opposition to demolitions, 25% to forcible transfer. No statements referred to meaningful consequences, individual criminal responsibility, or to grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. Now, if we look at 2020, there have been some pleasing developments. We've seen an increase overall in references to the illegality of settlements. The statements have referred more, from 43% to 57%, to opposition to demolition. There's been an increase in the statements referring to these violations as an obstacle to peace, from 35 to 48%. However, significantly, we've still seen no reference to meaningful consequences, to individual criminal responsibility, or to the fact that they represent a grave breach of the Geneva Convention. And what this means is borne out by the statistics in our final slide. So you can see between 2017 and 2020, the settler population in the occupied West Bank has increased from 628,000 to 683,000. It's now larger than the Palestinian population, and you've seen the demolitions. There were 419 demolitions in 2017. It's almost doubled to 848 in 2020. Now, that by no means suggests that we think that the statements are ineffective or are not welcome. In fact, the settlement population and demolitions would have been increased at a far greater rate without these statements. The point that we want to make clearly is that it's not addressing and it's not mitigating these increases. To actually address the increase in settler population, the increased demolitions, the increased violations, there must be more than just statements. There must be meaningful consequences, lawful countermeasures pursued by member states. And I'll end there, and I apologise for going slightly over time.
Thank you, Mr. Holt, for that. We'll come back to you during the questions. For further questions, I'm now going to Jerusalem, to Mr. Simon Randalls. If Mr. Randalls is on the line, I hereby give you the floor. Thank you. Simon, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. At this point, I won't add anything. I would like to leave as much time for questions and answers, if that's okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I now proceed to members of the committee. Deputy Cowan was an early entrant. I'll give you the floor. Deputy Cowan, followed by Deputy Brady, and I see Senator O'Reilly. Thank you. Deputy Cowan, thank you.
You can allow Deputy Brady for the moment, please. Thanks.
Okay, Deputy Brady, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair, and just thanks very much to our witnesses for, I think, a very thorough opening statement and PowerPoint in which has been circulated to all members as well. So I really appreciate that. And I think just to start my contribution, in the opening statement there in our presentation, we hear about the 96 statements that have been issued by the EU over the last year, and I think it's really concerning that the body tasked with dealing with wars and consequences, conflict, the UN Security Council, at its third attempt, could not even issue a statement voicing concerns about the civilian casualties, either in Gaza or Israel, or call for a ceasefire. So I think that is very, very telling, given the backdrop to our meeting here this morning, where over 60 children have now been butchered in Gaza, and over 200 people in total. Of course, this piece of work has been ongoing over the last while, and we've had a number of witnesses in at this point, and really what spurred the committee into looking at this issue prior to what is going on in the Gaza, and probably prior to, I suppose, some of the events in East Jerusalem with Sheikh Jarrah. It was I suppose the huge concerns in which I suppose members of the Oireachtas and members of the public witnessed with the demolition of Irish funded aid in Kirbet Humza late last year, where the settlement was completely destroyed, and very visible evidence of Irish funded structures and aid pictured with the stickers on it. So very, very telling. So I have a number of questions I just want to ask our witnesses, because we know the Irish government became a member of the West Bank Protection Consortium. I think it was in 2017. And following a number of questions I put to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, he has stated that Ireland has joined a compensation claim for the demolition of structures that have taken place. And I think there's a claim currently of 625,000 euros, which has been lodged. So I just ask our witnesses maybe to speak to that, what exactly the claim is for. And of course, when we hear about demolitions, maybe just elaborate what exactly we're talking about, because of course it's homes, it's schools, it's solar panels, it's basic infrastructure. So maybe our witnesses might just speak to that. And also the claim that has been lodged. When was that lodged? Was there previous claims lodged? And as to how much money, if any, has been paid out in compensation for the claims that have been made. Also, can I just ask, just in relation to, I suppose, upcoming demolitions, and there is a huge concern about a number of schools, and I think there's about 53 schools that are earmarked for demolition. And probably the one that is most prominent at this point is Ras Talin. So maybe just get a view from our witnesses in relation to that. It's probably the most high profile of all the schools that are up for demolition. And just in terms of, you know, we hear about the statements that have been issued and the impact that they have had on Israel in terms of their illegal activities. And a note in your opening statement here, you say it's a grave breach of the Geneva Convention and a war crime, maybe in the first instance, to elaborate on that. You also mentioned the need for more meaningful countermeasures, and the fact that there's no meaningful consequences for Israel and their illegal actions. Maybe you might just touch on what you would suggest in terms of countermeasures. And just to ask your views on whether you see the pattern which it has emerged over a number of years, as to whether it's been whether it's sustainable. I mean, we pay for houses, we pay for infrastructure, schools, etc. Then the Israelis come along and demolish them. we condemn it. You know, we lodge compensation claims. I'll be interested to hear what the outcome of those are. And then we come along and we donate more money to build it again. And in the meantime, families are, you know, God knows when the bulldozer is coming to demolish their property. So how sustainable is that going forward? So that's it for now, Chair. And hopefully I'll get an opportunity to come in later in the meeting when we hear some of the responses there.
I certainly would be keen that we'd have a further opportunity, obviously depending on the time. I'm going to Senator Joe O'Reilly and then back to Mr. Holt and Mr. Randalls. Joe O'Reilly, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity, and thank you to our guests for their presentations. It all is very enlightening and helps us to try to do our job. I'll only read one paragraph from your written initial presentation, and it's a very salient one. I think in the first 4 months of 2021, 316 structures were destroyed. I just want to read it back into the record, representing a 90% increase compared to the same period in 2020. Of particular note, this period witnessed a 108% increase of destructions of donor-funded structures compared to the same period in 2020. That's a very telling paragraph. I also think your chart it's a very bleak and sad chart on your last page, where you show the settler population consistently increasing up to 2020, and similarly the structures destroyed increasing. And of course, as we discussed last week, all of this being contrary to international law, and it's completely against the wishes of the Irish government, the EU, most of the UN, but it's still a very serious situation. I just would like to ask you, the recent horrific violence, in terms of its impact on medical services, schools, and the physical landscape and streets, etc., how much does this exacerbate the situation, and how far does this put your work in great jeopardy, to the extent what I mean is put an unreasonable burden on your work, given that we learned that, say, the Medicine St. Clair clinic was destroyed, that the streets are being shelled, that, you know, a lot of infrastructure, apart from obviously the tower with the press in it, but a lot of other physical infrastructure has been destroyed, and the impact of that would be interesting. Would not just it's horrific, but we'd like to get your response on that maybe. You say that you annually would give 50,000 people roughly practical aid. You might elaborate a bit on that. What happens the refugees, and this was raised at our committee previously, but if you would just, if you like, chronicle the outcome from a person who is forcibly removed, if you even talk for a little about the process of removal, where they go then, and your various interventions, and the likely outcome of their lives post demolition and post removal, and where they are, where they end up, is an important thing. You do reference in your presentation that the elections were a catalyst for making things worse in 2021. Would it be your view now that the past electoral situation might help a little post-electoral situation? And what would you think would be the impact of the geopolitical situation now, all the condemnations and all the focus on the war, that on the latest outbreaks, that when that sort of, hopefully, we all pray, settles, and there's something of an armistice and a peace, how would you see things develop then? Would you think, despite America's performance at the UN at the weekend, would you think that the Biden administration are likely to bring a level of pressure that may, and there's been an intervention I gather this morning there, that the Biden administration may put on a level of pressure that could hopefully halt the demolitions? Those are the things that I just raise at this point of the discussion. I think you make the case very clearly, and we're firmly against them. We have to work in concert at the UN and the EU to deal with it. And I hope that a council meeting today of the EU, the ministers, including our Irish minister, are dealing with it today. And let's hope that some strong words and actions come from that. And I take your point that it's not just enough, although, as you do say, it helps, but it's not just enough that this is a verbal response. It's contrary to international law, and it's a very, very serious state of affairs that these illegal settlements persist. So I'm just interested in your responses to those common stroke questions. Thanks, Chair, for the opportunity.
Thank you. I'm going to revert to our witnesses, say for a period of 5 minutes to deal with the responses to the queries as raised by Deputy Brady and Senator O'Reilly. I might start with Mr. Randalls, if I could, although I see Mr. Holt on screen.
Yeah, I think we'll split up the questions a little bit. So I'll take the question on compensation, types of demolitions and sustainability, and Simon will tackle some of the questions around IHL and breaches of the Geneva Convention. So I'll start with the question on compensation. I think important to clarify that when the donors to the West Bank Protection Consortium seek compensation, it's not before a court. So it's not a claim before a court. With the West Bank Protection Consortium, every single structure that's seized or demolished by the Israeli authorities, we record in a database, and we have done since 2015, including threats to those structures. We document the details of the incident, the Palestinians affected, and the financial injury to our donors. And then our donors collectively seek compensation from Israel. So to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to COGAT, who are responsible for operations in the West Bank. So we have been making these claims for over 3 years now, and we haven't to date received any compensation, although it's not something that we expected as well. I think very much part of why our member states seek compensation is to preserve their legal rights, to put Israel on notice that we are recording these losses and their impact, and to preserve the legal rights of member states to pursue further action if the compensation is unsuccessful. Israel's response is generally quite clear. They say that the construction supported by member states is not compliant with Israeli law and is illegal. We have very robust and strong expert analysis that says we're providing humanitarian aid in occupied territory. We don't need a construction permit from Israel, and it's very much in accordance with international humanitarian law. So compensation is sought to Israel either by démarche or through letter. It hasn't been received, but because we have recorded and preserved the legal rights, it does give member states the options to pursue lawful countermeasures against Israel for the destruction of humanitarian aid. So that could involve things like offsetting Irish aid to Israel, or offsetting collectively the aid of consortium donors, all the way up at the very top end to sanctions. But that's really ultimately a decision for member states to consider themselves. In relation to the types of demolitions, it's true, we often talk about demolitions of structures, which is quite a vague way of describing what's happening, because what's been demolished are homes that to Palestinian families, are the schools that they attend, are the health clinics that they use, water systems and solar panels. And this is much of what we support and deliver with our funding as well. It's obviously, some of these communities are quite remote and vulnerable already. So if you're destroying a health clinic or a school, it may mean that the children then have to walk 10 or 15 kilometres past a settlement where they're exposed to harassment and violence as a result of the demolition of that school. So the impact is extremely significant on vulnerable Palestinian communities. On the issue of sustainability, fortunately, as I mentioned before, I think we've delivered some 4,000 schools, homes, community centres since 2015. Over 92% are still in place. And I think partly that is because when we deliver infrastructure, it includes the logos of all our member states, the flags of all our member states. So we think that offers some deterrent, and that is borne out by the fact that 92% are still in place. So the demolition rate of consortium structures is far below that of other self-funded homes and of other donor-funded homes. So it's still definitely, we would say it's still an effective investment. Not to say that it's still imperative that what is demolished that Israel are held accountable for. But in terms of the financial figure, the consortium has received some 50 million euros since its formation. Less than 1.3% of that has been lost as a result of demolition. So we would still say it's an effective investment, and more than that, we're providing critical humanitarian aid that really does ensure the viability of the two-state solution. And without the aid that we provide, the risk of forcible transfers of Palestinians will be greatly increased. Finally, before I hand over to Simon, I mean, you touched on the current situation and statements that have been made. We welcome the statements made by the State Department on behalf of the Biden administration in relation to Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa. Although they've been noticeably quieter in relation to Gaza. It's a good first step. But we've seen in the past, as we showed on our graphs, statements on their own without meaningful consequences won't be enough to deter demolitions, to deter evictions, and to deter violations. So definitely we welcome the statement by the US administration on Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa Mosque, but it's imperative that these statements go beyond mere condemnation to meaningful consequences, including offsetting aid, including withdrawing from voluntary agreements, and of course, at the upper end, sanctions. Finally, on the point of how it's affected us, I mean, the majority of our operations as the West Bank Protection Consortium are in the West Bank, but certainly all our partners are already operate in Gaza. It's having an incredibly significant impact on staff and their families, especially those families with children. We've had a number of staff who have had their homes damaged or destroyed. The impact on their mental health is severe. Obviously, we've seen MSF clinic being damaged, which is affecting their capacity to provide aid. And in the West Bank as well, we've seen a dramatic increase in violence, both perpetrated by the military and settlers and Palestinians as well. And that means that for us, it has been more difficult to access the community. So it has had an impact, although we still in the West Bank are able to access communities and provide aid. I will hand over to you now, Simon.
Thank you. I will take the two sort of legally rooted questions first on grave breaches and countermeasures. By way of explanation, my background is in international humanitarian law, so I can speak with some confidence on these questions. Grave breaches, quite simply, those are enumerated in the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 as grave breaches. Those conduct which constitute a particularly heinous form of conduct within the context of armed conflict. That would include, for instance, willful killing, forcible transfers, the extensive destruction of property where it's not justified by military necessity, for example. Those same grave breaches which relate to state practice, so would bind Israel and other signatories to the Geneva Conventions, are also classified in different legal instruments as war crimes. So, for instance, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, for instance, considers forcible transfer, extensive destruction, absent military necessity as war crimes as well, which in essence means that individuals can be prosecuted. So a military commander could be prosecuted, for instance. The question on countermeasures or sort of concrete measures that states can take, what that might look like. There is, I think, a broad menu ranging in degrees of coercion. At the sort of the top end, you have things like sanctions, restrictive measures. I think the European Union would typically refer to them, asset freezes, that kind of thing. I think we're quite some way away from that in this particular context. There are, however, alternative measures of retortion, which could be applied. That might include, for instance, the deduction of funds from bilateral agreements between, for instance, Ireland and Israel, or in EU association agreements with Israel, for instance, equivalent to that's been lost through destruction of property in the West Bank. There are a whole range of measures which may be taken. What we're particularly emphasizing with states, though, is to actually take efforts to formally map those options available to them. So first, in order to undertake those measures and implement them, you need to understand what you're entitled to do. That's something that the consortium is particularly happy to assist on, and there are a range of ways in which that can be done, but that's more of an internal process. The question on schools, yeah, it's absolutely correct that the education cluster within the West Bank has identified 53 schools at risk of demolition, Palestinian schools at risk of demolition. That doesn't actually include kindergartens, so the number of educational facilities is likely much higher. And as Chris has already touched upon, the issues relating to threats to education is in fact far broader than merely the destruction of schools. Also physical access restrictions, violence from settlers, harassment from soldiers, for instance, and that has significant and far-reaching implications for our beneficiaries and generational implications, frankly. I think the final question which we touched upon, in following on from demolitions, where do people go? It's a fantastic question. In some cases, in fact, many cases, they seek to stay in the same areas where those demolitions took place, and emergency support is then subsequently provided by humanitarian organizations, ideally, although sometimes that's made difficult by restrictions on our movement put in place by Israeli authorities. Some relocate to stay with friends and families, and move away from the area because they don't wish to be displaced again. And frankly, some we don't know where they go. There is such this has been such a historic issue. Demolitions, although we gave a 5-year overview, of a much far more long-running issue. And in terms of actually monitoring where people go, it can be quite difficult from a logistical perspective. And I will end there to allow time for further intervention.
Thank you. Back to our committee. I'm calling Senator Crockwell, followed by Deputy Clark.
Deputy Clark first.
I'll take Deputy Clark first. Her hand has been raised for quite some time.
Deputy Clark was there ahead of me, Chair. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our contributors for your time and your expertise this morning. I don't intend to go over other questions that have been asked. I would like to get some further information on some of the comments that have been made, though. What I would like to start with saying is I absolutely agree with you. This is an occupation situation, and there is absolute evidence of coercive environment that Palestinian people are living with. And I would also say that there is nobody, certainly nobody in my life that I know, that can look at the destruction, the devastation, the death and the suffering of Palestinian people for years and decades at this point without utter disgust and anger, and never more so than in recent days. And I think we need to be very mindful of those people who are on social media, who are highlighting and who are exposing what is happening on the ground there following the destruction of the media site. This is a moral issue, it's a human issue, and it's a building international political crisis for the UN and for the EU. You mentioned briefly, Christopher, that the bilateral agreement deductions from an EU perspective, the equivalent to the property destruction. Based on your experience and on your expertise, what is the estimation of the value of the destruction that has taken place, and what would be the time frame for rebuilding of same? Now, in relation to the funded structures, the donor-funded structures, the ones that have experienced over the 108% of demolition, you also referenced targets or structures that would be targeted for future demolition. Do you have any idea of what they may be? Can you give us some information on what that would be? And finally, the impact of the continued destruction and on the aid provision and the aid donation. I absolutely agree with you. It is an effective investment. But from your point of view, what impact does it have on the level of aid and the level of services that you can provide from the human side of it? You did mention the staff that were there and the experiences that they're having at the minute. But what impact does it have on your availability to get these staff to go into this area, to continue to work and to continue to provide the services that you do? And what would you see as the primary focus on your role for the provision of aid in relation to those structures that have been destroyed?
And Senator Crockwell, before reverting to our witnesses to deal with Deputy Star's queries.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses who came before the committee today, and thank you for a very comprehensive report. The question I want to ask is probably one that nobody really wants to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and that is, donations are coming in to support the erection of structures, and in some cases these structures are being demolished. And I'm trying to understand why we would erect any building in a disputed area where as soon as it's built, the desire on the other side is to demolish it. And I'm wondering, before a structure is built, is there any engagement with the Israeli side in order to try and get some agreement on where? I'm talking about the foreign money now. I don't want to get into the conflict at this point in time. I'm looking at demolitions and what happens there. And I'm wondering, in order to avoid demolitions, can we not, with the foreign money, the foreign aid that's gone in, is there not a way that we can engage with the Israeli government or the Israeli officials and agree locations, rather than build structures, have people move into them and then have them displaced as soon as the structure is demolished? Not for 1 minute justifying the demolition of anything. I'm just trying to understand why would you build in a place where you know it's going to be demolished? I'll leave it at that, Chair, at this point.
Thank you. I see Deputy David Stanton offering, and I'll call on Deputy Stanton. Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman. Again, I want to welcome our guests here today, and thank you for your presentation. I think a picture paints 1,000 words, and the last slide you put up there with the separate realities certainly shows the reality, if you like, whereby in one you have, if I'm correct, heated swimming pools and so on, and lush green pasture and 21st century infrastructure, and the other you're going back what looks like to the 13th century. I mean, it's shocking when you see the contrast. We know that there are 680,000 settlers now in this area. Could I ask, are there incentives given to people to move into these areas from Israel? The settlers, is the property free? Do you know what incentivizes them to move in there? So that's one question. Should the international community be calling for some of these people to move back out of there, 680,000, which is quite a lot of people? And what would the implications of that be if that would be the case? Mr. Randall's made a point there earlier, which I thought was quite interesting. You mentioned generational implications. Now, it would strike me when I look at the images and on both sides here of people being killed and all kinds of mayhem going on and children being killed and so on, that the hate that's being built up here for future generations can be calculated on both sides. And I mean, again, I think we should all, Chairman, call on both sides to cease hostilities immediately. That's the very first thing that should happen, and then move on from there. But just the questions I had there about the actual incentives, possible incentives that people are given to move in there, and then should we be calling on some of these people to move out, if not all of them? And you failed the other question about the generational implications. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Mr. Holt, please.
Thank you for the questions. And again, I'll start and then hand over to Simon. So, yeah, on the value or the loss as a result of demolition. So I think important to note first that we're only speaking of what the consortium has lost as a result of demolitions. Obviously, the financial impact on Palestinians and other aid actors is far greater. So we can only speak of our intervention. But in terms of the financial injuries that has resulted, From our intervention since 2015, it's 750,000 euro as a result of demolitions and seizures since we began. As I mentioned, that's still less than 1.4% of the overall investment. So we still think it's an effective investment, particularly considering that what we're providing is vital humanitarian aid. In terms of what's at risk for us, there's about 1.6 million that are under threat. So that means that they've either been issued a demolition order or a stop work order. In most cases, it is before the court now, with our legal aid actors seeking to have that demolition order overturned, and generally there's an injunction order in place preventing the demolition. But 1.6 million at threat, and that involves a large number of homes, of schools, which was discussed before, some 53 schools, as well as health clinics, community centres, water and energy infrastructure. But it's important to note that that's purely what's under threat in terms of what we're provided. What's at threat of demolition beyond our intervention is far greater than that, and really puts at significant risk that the two-state solution, the viability of the two-state solution. In terms of the impact on our staff and our beneficiaries, yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult operating environment. We've chosen to operate in East Jerusalem and Area C because that's where the needs are greatest. That's where Palestinians are most vulnerable, where they have the least access to livelihoods, to essential services. And as humanitarians, we make these decisions on humanitarian principles on where the needs are greatest. And that's why we choose to operate in Area C, but it is difficult. The case of Hamza al-Bakaya, which was referenced earlier, is a very good example where aid actors are under considerable pressure, where they're blocked from accessing communities, where once we did deliver a lot of that aid, it was then seized and confiscated. So it does make it difficult to provide effective aid in an environment like that. On the questions on why we do deliver this assistance, despite the fact we know some of it will be demolished. I think, again, going back to what we call our retention rate, over 92% of our structures that we've provided, over 92% of the physical structures that we've provided remain in place and with the Palestinian communities that they were intended for. So it's still an effective investment in that we've been able to ensure that most of the aid we provide remains with Palestinian communities. On the question of why we would intervene in quote-unquote disputed territories, I think the first point to note is the territory is not disputed. It's occupied Palestinian territory. And that's something that's almost unanimously agreed under international law by multiple Security Council resolutions, which obviously comprises quite diverse permanent members and non-permanent members, as well as resolutions of the General Assembly, and as well as the majority of member states. The majority of member states recognise that it's occupied Palestinian territory, not disputed territory. And that is the reason that we do provide aid in occupied Palestinian territory. We act in accordance with international humanitarian law. We do make sure that we comply with all our legal obligations as humanitarian actors. We do provide the Israeli authorities with prior notice. All our interventions are contained in the UN humanitarian response plan that is shared with the Israeli authorities. So they know that we're providing humanitarian aid based on humanitarian needs assessments that is vital to Palestinians, without which they would be at great risk. However, the demolitions still continue. Finally, on why we couldn't seek approval, for example, through the Israeli legal systems, because there's an inherently discriminatory illegal system that applies in Area C. Less than 1% of territory in Area C is allocated for Palestinian development. The vast majority is completely off limits or is highly restricted, which means any application for Palestinian construction is almost impossible to be granted. So any sort of notion that there is a way to apply for a construction permit when less than 1% of area is designated for Palestinian construction is unfortunately a fiction. However, the same authorities do grant permission for illegal Israeli settlements to be built in Area C, and in fact legalize under Israeli law what a legal Israeli outpost. So I'll hand over to Simon at this point to address the other questions.
Mr. Randalls, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly follow up on the question of disputed territories. Again, as Chris has identified, we are talking about occupied territory. It's fair to say that Israel rejects that diagnosis. Israel says these are disputed territories. There are very few countries in the world that would agree with that. And we know why Israel would say that, because if it's not occupied territory, international humanitarian law cannot apply. So Israel, in fact, frees itself of this multitude of very significant obligations it would have as occupying power. So we understand the motivations, but we should collectively push back against that. The question on incentives for settlers to live in settlements. Yes, there are a wide range of financial incentives made available. As far as I understand, that consists of reduced property prices, grants for establishing businesses, preferential, I think, tax rates as well. I think there's a fairly broad range, but yes, there are these incentives. And this is another question that Israel has flagged and said, look, settlers aren't a legal violation because we're not physically transporting them to the West Bank, whereas it's been determined by far more authoritative legal voices than myself that creating these incentives and promoting this transfer is also constitutes a violation. Should the international community be seeking to asking for settlers to be removed? Yes, in essence. Whether that would be successful is another question. Israel hasn't been at all shy about this, has clearly identified this. Goes back, I think, to the 70s. There's a quote from Ariel Sharon, former Israeli Prime Minister, who said, what we will take now, we will hold, meaning what land we can kind of put our roots in, we will remain or become sovereign Israeli territory. So it's this creating facts on the ground, this de facto annexation, which has been a pattern for decades. And this is why it's something that we are so firmly pushing back against. Insofar, and I think the point that I'll close on is that what we really need to focus on is addressing this curve that we showed in that last slide, or this trajectory of settlement expansion and settler population. The only way that curve looks acceptable from an international law perspective is if it's going down, and that's one point that I will finish on. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the clock. Maybe I'd ask Mr. Holt just to make a final comment, a final message following your presentation to our committee. Is there any parting words that you'd like to leave with us? And I wish to thank you for meeting with us, for the preparation of your slides, and indeed for dealing with members' questions. I very much regret that the time was somewhat shorter than our members would wish. But nevertheless, it was an important engagement, and it was most useful to us in terms of our study. And I would ask you maybe for 1 minute's final direct message. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity today. And I think I'd go back to my initial statement to reiterate that the violence we see today in Gaza, Israel, and in the occupied West Bank does not occur within a vacuum. It occurs in the context and in the backdrop of a 54-year occupation, one that is defined by violation of Palestinian rights and a lack of accountability, including demolitions, including settler violence, including settlement expansion. And we must move beyond mere condemnation to pursuing meaningful consequences if we're to have any hope of preventing further violations and ensuring the viability of a two-state solution, which is essential to the safety of Israelis, of Palestinians, and to the region. We must move beyond mere condemnation to meaningful consequences for violation of Palestinian rights. And I will leave you with that message there. Thank you on behalf of the West Bank Protection Consortium for the opportunity to address the committee today.
Thank you very much. Can I once again thank you for the manner in which you dealt with our questions. And could I say to you, as well as your presentation this morning, if you have any documentation that you would wish to furnish the committee with by way of annual report, interim report, any documentation that you have prepared that you feel might be of assistance to the committee in the context of our work, I would say send it straight on to us and we would be very happy to receive it. So thank you both. And let me acknowledge the work that the consortium is doing for and on behalf of the people of the 10 states in the European Union. And we acknowledge what you're doing and we wish you success in your endeavours, albeit in very difficult and challenging circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. In the second part of our meeting this afternoon, I want to welcome Ms. Koch Moran, the Director of Middle East and North Africa Unit in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and Phelim McLaughlin, Director Global Programmes in Irish Aid. Can I say the format of the meeting is that we will hear the opening statement before going into a question and answer session with members of the committee. As we are quite time limited due to COVID restrictions, I'd ask that the witnesses be conscious of the time constraints when initially addressing the committee so as to allow for maximum engagement. Following the opening statements, we'll have a discussion with questions and answers. I would ask members to be concise in questions, and I'll allocate 3.5 minutes to each member in the hope that we might be in a position to have a second round to deal with further outstanding questions. And I would remind witnesses of the long-standing parliamentary practice that we shouldn't criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make them identifiable or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of that person or entity. Therefore, if statements are potentially defamatory in relation to a person or entity that might in any way be identifiable, obviously you'll be directed to discontinue your remarks. But I'm quite confident that senior officials in the Department of Foreign Affairs will be more than careful in the exercise of their words and use of their language. For witnesses attending remotely from outside the Leinster House campus, there are limitations to parliamentary privilege, and as such mightn't benefit from the same level of immunity from legal proceedings as a witness that might be physically present within the confines of Leinster House does. Witnesses participating in the committee from a jurisdiction outside the state are advised also to be mindful of domestic law and how domestic law may apply to evidence given. So with that, I'm very pleased to call on Ms. Moran, followed by Mr. McLaughlin, to make your opening statement. Thank you both for joining us. Ms. Moran, thank you.
Chair, thank you very much, and I hope that you can hear me okay.
Thank you.
Chair and members of the committee, thank you very much for the invitation for the Department of Foreign Affairs to come and brief the committee. Obviously, we're very conscious of the context in which we are speaking to you today and of the events over the last week in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. And Minister Coveney has made a statement to the Seanad on that matter yesterday evening, with which you'll be familiar. I wanted to join with my colleague Phelim McLaughlin, our Director for Global Programmes in the Department, to first set out briefly the context for Ireland's development and humanitarian assistance programme to the Palestinian people. Ireland's objective is to achieve a just, enduring and stable peace in the Middle East. This foreign policy goal frames and shapes the Irish Aid approach to the region. Ireland's programme of assistance is an integral part of Ireland's contribution to a sustainable peace. Ireland's vision for peace in the Middle East is a vision shared with our EU partners, and is one for the realisation of a negotiated two-state solution with an independent, democratic, viable and contiguous Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security with Israel and its other neighbours. Development and humanitarian aid from donors plays a vital role. However, it cannot substitute for the ending of the occupation, which alone can fully unlock a future Palestinian state's potential. This understanding underpins Ireland's engagement in the occupied Palestinian territory. Ireland's aid programme is delivered in the context of a continued deterioration in the situation on the ground and a steady rise in needs amongst the Palestinian population. The situation, as we have seen very clearly over the last week, is volatile and unpredictable. As I said, Minister Coveney set out Ireland's position and gave a statement to the Seanad on the matter yesterday evening, and he spoke at the UN Security Council on the matter on Sunday evening. The occupation of Palestinian territory by Israel continues to be the most significant obstacle to Palestinian development. This informs Ireland's approach both in our bilateral engagement and through multilateral channels, including at the European Union and at the United Nations. Ireland's position is based on a firm commitment to the negotiated two-state solution that ends the occupation that began in 1967, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states, on the basis of international law, including the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. A series of negative trends on the ground, in particular the continued advancement of settlements, demolitions and threatened evictions in the West Bank, are undermining the potential for a successfully negotiated conclusion to the conflict. Ireland works very hard to address these issues based on international law and the agreed international parameters. I want to turn over to my colleague, Phelan McLaughlin, who will now address you on the Irish Aid programme. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moran. Mr. McLaughlin, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. As my colleague has just set out, Ireland's overall policy aim is to assist in securing a lasting and just political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to support the negotiation of a two-state solution with an independent, democratic and viable Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel and its other neighbours. Ireland has had a long-standing commitment to this objective. Ireland was the first European community, as it was, member state to adopt support for a two-state solution as official policy back in February of 1980. Our development cooperation support to the Palestinian people flows from this policy and aims to contribute to maintaining the space for a two-state solution. This work, which is part of the Irish Aid programme managed by the Department of Foreign Affairs, focuses on 4 areas. Firstly, on supporting state-building efforts. Secondly, on the provision of humanitarian relief. Thirdly, on the protection and promotion of human rights. And fourthly, on support for Palestine refugees. The capacity of Palestinian governance institutions and civil society is an important underlying theme of our approach. The Irish Aid Palestine programme has been in existence for just over 2 decades, since the year 2000. This year, Irish Aid plans to invest almost 16 million euro in the occupied Palestinian territory. We and Ireland's representative office in Ramallah will cooperate with the United Nations, with other multilateral partners, with civil society organisations, humanitarian agencies and the Palestinian Authority in delivering the programme. Overall, the EU and its member states are consistently the largest donor to the Palestinian people, with total funding estimated at more than 600 million per annum in recent years. In the area of state building, Ireland's particular focus is on strengthening the quality of education, which will be essential to the long-term prosperity of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian state. The Palestinian Authority's Ministry of Education has a particularly important function in what is a very young society, where nearly 40% of the population is under the age of 14. The ministry aims to provide comprehensive and safe access to quality education across the occupied territory. Our view is that a robust and effective ministry can help to foster social unity across the Palestinian territories and is indispensable in raising the skills and knowledge base of the Palestinian people. Education also serves an important function in promoting critical thinking and enhancing job opportunities. Ireland's aim is to build the capacity of Palestinian educational institutions and by extension to empower the Palestinian population. Our main vehicle for doing this is what's known as a joint financing arrangement. This is essentially where we and a number of other countries pool our support to the Palestinian Education Ministry. We support them in areas like curriculum development and educational reform. And Ireland spends €3 million a year through this mechanism. We also have a scholarship scheme for Palestinian students where we bring promising individuals to Ireland to study for a master's degree. Again, the aim is to build the capacity of Palestinian society by giving individuals the knowledge and experience that they need to make a positive contribution in the future. We presently award 25 of these Ireland Fellowships per year. The promotion and protection of human rights in the Palestinian territory is a fundamental pillar of our work. We recognise the indispensable role of civil society in promoting and protecting human rights and the rule of law. Respect for human rights, accountability and transparency facilitate peace and stability and contribute to better governance. Our human rights and democratisation scheme supports both Israeli and Palestinian NGOs in 5 priority areas: freedom of movement, rule of law, rights of prisoners and detainees, women's rights and democratic development. Our representative office works with partner bodies and has developed strong relationships with them over the years. And our total funding in this area in 2021 will be €1 million. Of course, as you just heard from representatives of the West Bank Protection Consortium, we, DG ECHO, which is the branch of the European Commission responsible for humanitarian aid, and a number of other states are members of and donors to the consortium. We've supported them since 2017 in their work to protect vulnerable Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. As you've heard, the consortium provides material and humanitarian assistance and legal aid, and our budgeted contribution to the consortium in 2021 is €200,000. Another pillar of our approach is our support to Palestine refugees through UNRWA, which is the UN Relief and Works Agency, which provides education, healthcare, and humanitarian relief to Palestine refugees. There are approximately 5.7 million registered refugees living in the occupied Palestinian territory and also in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. The Minister for Foreign Affairs signed a 3-year partnership agreement with UNRWA in March of this year. Under the terms of that agreement, we provide them with €6 million a year in core funding to the end of 2023. We also provide annual funding to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or UNOCHA as it's known, and we're providing them with $500,000 in 2021. That includes $300,000, which goes into a humanitarian fund, which can then be drawn on by the humanitarian coordinator to respond to humanitarian emergencies. Finally, Mr. Chair, to refer to the impact of the COVID pandemic. As with all of our developing country partners, no matter where they are in the world, the main issue in relation to vaccination in the occupied territory is the global shortage of vaccine supply. As members will be aware, Ireland is supporting the COVAX initiative, that aims to deliver 2 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines to 92 low and middle income countries, including the Palestinian territories, by the end of 2021. COVAX has also negotiated options on a further 1 billion doses. In March, the EU announced that it would double its funding to COVAX from 500 million to €1 billion. When you take that with the commitments from individual EU member states, that brings the entire EU pledge to COVAX to €2.5 billion. In February, COVAX confirmed that the occupied Palestinian territory was a priority participant in the program. The first COVAX shipment, which contained 61,440 doses, was received in the Palestinian territories in March of this year. COVAX deliveries to the occupied territory in the first and second quarters of this year are projected at 308,000 doses. According to the World Health Organization's figures from this week, a total of 416,000 people in the occupied Palestinian territory have been vaccinated with supplies from COVAX and also from other sources. In addition to our COVAX support, we have provided additional resources to a number of organizations which have been working in the Palestinian territory since the outbreak of the pandemic. They include UNRWA, they include the UN Humanitarian Fund, the World Bank, and Oxfam. And we've also provided funds via an EU mechanism which is known as PEGAS, and that provides direct support to Palestinian citizens. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, Ireland's support to the Palestinian people through the Irish Aid Programme has a number of aims: to help maintain the space for a two-state solution, to build the capacity of the Palestinian people through the provision of quality education, to contribute to ensuring that human rights and accountability are upheld, that humanitarian relief is provided to those who need it, and that the needs of Palestine refugees are met. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin, and earlier Ms. Moran. I now come to members of the committee, and I'll start with Deputy John Brady and would ask members to raise their hands thereafter. Thank you, Deputy Brady.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Phelim and Coid, for your opening presentations and all the work that we're doing within the Foreign Affairs Department, and of course our Irish Aid and our huge effort to Palestinians in the occupied territories. And I suppose just to pick up on where we finished off our conversation with our previous witnesses in relation to the destruction of state or donations by member states, etc. And they outlined the compensation claim that they have lodged 625,000 in terms of the destruction of aid that they have provided. We are part of that consortium. We are part of that compensation claim. So they outlined the process around that ultimately falls on the state to pursue that. So can I just ask for an update in relation to that specific compensation claim? And can I also ask for a broader overview of state-funded aid that has been destroyed by Israel in the occupied territories? Of course, I mean East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and within Gaza over, say, the last 10-year period. And how much can you put a cost on the amount of Irish aid that has been destroyed by Israel, and what measures have been taken outside of the compensation claim through the West Bank Protection Consortium? What compensation claim has been lodged with the Israeli authorities in relation to the destruction of that aid? Because of course we have seen, not just in recent times in relation to Sheikh Jarrah and in terms of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, we've seen it previously in terms of Gaza, where we've seen schools demolished there as well. So it would be great to get an overview on that. Can I also ask, just in terms of our two previous witnesses also stated that, you know, statements go so far, they don't really have a significant impact on the Israeli assault on the occupied territories, and, you know, the forced displacements, the illegal settlements continue, and they have asked for, along with a whole range of civil society, NGOs, etc., have asked for more meaningful countermeasures. They've asked for, you know, more meaningful consequences. Can I just ask, in terms of any analysis that has been carried out within the department as to what countermeasures might look like. And I know, and I will have to agree to disagree on the issue of the Occupied Territories Bill, because I know it will be kicked back that, you know, based on the Attorney General's advice, that the Occupied Territories Bill is not lawful. I will argue all day and all night against that. But can I ask, outside of that, what work has gone on within the department to identify countermeasures that could be taken for the Israeli actions, and whether you could outline what those countermeasures could look like? And just in terms of, and quite laid out the Irish government's position in terms of the two-state solution, a viable Palestinian state. Can I ask, what does a viable Palestinian state look like? Can you define that? Are we talking about the 1967 borders? If so, the 680,000 illegal settlers in the occupied territories, what is the situation? Is the Irish government asking for those to leave the occupied territories? Also, can I just ask in relation to annexation? And we know, and the Minister has previously talked about creeping annexation. He's talked all sorts of annexation, but annexation is happening on the ground. So can I just get a view in relation to annexation from Kite in relation to that? And also we know de jure annexation has happened, and only last year, I think it was the previous US President Trump recognized the illegal annexation of the Golan and East Jerusalem. Can I ask as to what measures were taken by the Irish government in terms of the illegal de jure annexation that I speak about? So I think, sorry, I just have one or two other questions there. Can I just ask, in relation to the demolition of state buildings, just to get an up-to-date position, just in relation to the 53 schools that have been identified in the occupied West Bank that are earmarked for demolition, and particularly the Ras Al Tin school, which has been funded by European aid, and I think certainly Irish aid might be involved in that. So can I just get a view, an up-to-date position in relation to the demolitions there? And just what impact do our witnesses think might be had if Ireland was to follow through in terms of the Dáil, unanimous Dáil vote to call on the Irish government to officially recognise Palestine? What impact would that have if we actually follow through, if any impact, if we actually follow through and officially recognised the state of Palestine, obviously based on the 67 borders of, you know, with East Jerusalem as the capital? And just the final question there, what more can the Irish government and the international community do to protect human rights and indeed the right of life of Palestinians? And just as a follow-up question, does Ireland support the investigation by the International Criminal Court into the human rights abuses in terms of, you know, contravention of the Geneva Convention? And what is the view of the recent remarks of the Israeli regime that they will not be participating in the said investigation? Thanks, Chair.
Brady, I'll go briefly to Deputy Clerk and Senator Crockwell before coming back to our witnesses, conscious of the time, but wishing to ensure that everyone has an opportunity. Deputy Clerk, please.
I'm conscious of the time too, Chair, so I will be concise and brief. Thank you for your time and for the ongoing work that takes place in the Department of Foreign Affairs. I would like to agree with what John has just said regarding the value of the aid that has been destroyed and any actions that has been taken. I note that the Irish aid plans to invest almost 16 million this year in the occupied Palestinian territories. We've had mention of education, we've had mention of some other initiatives. Is there, can you give us some more detail of what that 16 million will actually look like on the ground to those in Palestine? And also, in relation to those 25 fellowships that are offered to Palestinian students, would you have any information into what those master programs are in and what the progression on from them are? And finally, has there been any plans discussed in recent days, given the events, to alter or to review the targeting of aid fundings as a result of what's happened over there, as to the high level of destruction that has taken place? And finally, from your perspective, so from the point of view of Foreign Affairs, what does accountability look like here? What does human rights look like here? And again, from the perspective of the most recent events. Thank you.
Senator Crockwell, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I want to thank both witnesses for comprehensive presentations this afternoon. I'll be brief. Ms. Moran, I'm just wondering what the official position of Ireland is. Do we now regard what's going on as de facto annexation? I think Deputy Brady has already touched on that, but I would like to know what our official position is there. And the second one, I know what I'm going to ask is irking some people, but from the Irish Aid point of view, we're pumping money into Palestine, and rightly so. And the work that's been done is genuine work to deliver the types of things that have been laid out by Mr. McLaughlin, the education, etc. Human rights is something we all have an interest in. But I am concerned that monies that are given, particularly for the construction of buildings that are in disputed areas. Now, some people will call them occupied areas, other people will call them disputed areas. It doesn't matter what we call them. What we know is that if you put a building up, they're going to come and knock it down. And I'm wondering, is there any caveats attached to funds that are put in by Irish Aid with respect to the construction of buildings? I can see some of my colleagues irked at me making that statement, but at the end of the day, my concern is that monies that we spend to aid the Palestinian people should be monies that have a long-term effect. It just, for the life of me, I cannot understand why we would fund something that will be bulldozed down a couple of weeks after it's completed, disrupting everybody. So I don't want to get into the argument. I want to get the argument of whether it's annexed land or whether it is occupied territories. I want to get into the discussion of demolitions and sort of what we do about that. So I leave it at that, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cockrell. I'm coming back to Ms. Moran and Mr. McLaughlin. I'm conscious of the terms of reference of our review in terms of demolitions of buildings and displacements of communities and people. I'm also conscious of the opening comment of Ms. Moran when she indicated quite rightly that matters are somewhat fluid, as well as being very sensitive. I know a number of political questions have been directed at our witnesses. I would remind members, as Ms. Moran stated, of Minister Coveney's up-to-date speech last night to the Seanad, and I will ask that a copy of that speech be circulated to members as soon as this meeting ends, because it will be helpful to us. But conscious of the situation, I'd ask Ms. Moran and Mr. McLaughlin to deal as best they can with the many questions that have been directed at them. Thank you, Ms. Moran.
Chair, with your permission, I might begin and then...
oh, yes. Sorry, Mr. McLaughlin, you're not on my screen now, but you can proceed. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you say, Chair, there's a lot of ground to cover there.
Ideal.
If there's anything that I don't reply satisfactorily, I'd be very happy to deal with it in writing subsequently. On the point in relation to the compensation claim, I mean, it's very much as your previous witnesses put it. This isn't something that goes before a court. It is something that we collectively do with other donors, and we raise it with the Israeli authorities and have done on a regular basis. We've done at ambassadorial level, and indeed the Minister for Foreign Affairs has raised it with his counterparts as well, and that is something that we will continue to do. It's also something that the Minister for Foreign Affairs has raised regularly in Brussels at the Foreign Affairs Committee or the Foreign Affairs Council in order to, I suppose, build coalitions across member states. In terms of, there's a question in relation to the scholarship program, the Ireland Fellows, and the range of master's programs. It's across a very wide range of disciplines. The program itself, actually, it's only in its second year, and we have a third intake due to begin, all going well, later in 2021. We have people who are doing things from a medical background. We have people who are working in areas related to engineering, for example. So it's a wide range of disciplines. And the aim, essentially, is, as I said, to try and identify people who have potential to really make a difference in Palestinian society into the future, and to give them the skill sets that they need to, in order to be able to do that. In terms of what it looks like, I think what it looks like is improved education in schools that are run by the Palestinian authorities. I mean, that's a primary outcome that we want to see, and that we've been working towards for many years. Better curriculum and better opportunities for children who are going through the PA schools. It also looks like the services that UNRWA provide to refugees on a daily basis. And there are millions of refugees in the occupied territories and more broadly within the region. And UNRWA provides them with education, it provides them with healthcare, in many cases provides them with shelter. It also looks like the humanitarian aid that's being provided in Gaza and elsewhere at the moment, in terms of provision of emergency shelters, emergency water, sanitation, equipment. It looks like the legal aid that the West Bank Consortium is giving people to take legal cases in relation to forced evictions. Just with respect to Senator Crockwell's point on the long-term, I suppose the long-term objectives of the programme and the need to really focus on those. I mean, that's very much at the heart of what we do. And that's why we focus on things like the improvement of education, because that has the potential to I suppose, empower future generations of people. And that's a lasting legacy. That's something that can't be demolished overnight. So that capacity building, that education, ensuring that people's human rights are observed, that they have legal aid in order to take legal action where that's necessary. All of that sort of longer term strategic work is very much at the centre of what we do. So I fully take your point on that. Maybe I'll pass the floor now to Coit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members, for those questions. Just to, I suppose, add on to what my colleague Salem has said, as we set out, the programme operates in a very political context, and both from a Department of Foreign Affairs perspective and from the point of view of our embassies in Tel Aviv and our representative office in Ramallah, we very much support the programme through political engagement, including in the problem areas when those issues arise and the difficulties that can arise in that respect. And our representative office in Ramallah is very active on the ground, and our ambassador in Tel Aviv is very active on the ground in making representations to the Israeli authorities on the difficulties that arise in relation to both settlements and demolitions and the threat of eviction. And sometimes that presence is extremely important in terms of the types of visits that our representative in Ramallah has done in Jerusalem around Sheikh Jarrah and around Silwan, the Silwan neighbourhoods that you've spoken about before. And that demonstration and that public advocacy and voice is extremely important, and something that we do very much along with EU and like-minded partners. Just to come to some of the questions that the members have asked, in terms of the actions available to the department, as the colleagues from the West Bank Protection Consortium, who I know you discussed the matter with earlier, will have pointed out, we very much act as a consortium with the West Bank Protection Consortium. We act as a collective, and it's extremely important that we look at those actions collectively as a group, and that's the route that we take. Obviously, Ireland also engages very strongly at EU level with various mechanisms of the EU in looking at these issues and the impact of those issues as well. So it is very active engagement. And as I mentioned, also at the United Nations as well, in terms of the kind of statements Ireland makes at the United Nations, highlighting what we see as the violation of international law and international humanitarian law in respect of issues around settlements and demolitions and threatened evictions. Deputy Brady, just to come to your question on annexation, and Senator Crockwell, you asked that point as well. I think the Minister has set out very clearly the position on that issue yesterday evening in the Channel. It is a clear position. The fact of the matter is that the settlements under international law are illegal, and we operate on that basis, and we do everything that we can do in that respect. Our position is very much based on international law and very much around Israel's obligations as an occupying power under the 4th Geneva Convention and on the resolutions of the Security Council. And I suppose that goes to the point that you were discussing earlier in terms of the imperative and the humanitarian imperative for Ireland providing assistance in Area C under very difficult circumstances. And that is very much what drives us, is that issue of responsibilities which we see being failed as an occupying power, and the obligation on donors to step up and to provide humanitarian assistance around that. In relation to the question you posed on recognition, again, that I would probably regard that as a political issue. Deputy and the Minister has set out the government's position on that on a number of occasions, including last night in the chat. In relation to the point that you asked about the International Criminal Court, Ireland's approach to that and to the conflict is based, as I mentioned, on international law and on international parameters. And we are a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and we're a firm supporter of the work of the court and of the role of the court. And in relation to the investigation of the situation in Palestine, Ireland is very committed to preserving both the independence and the impartiality of the court and their judicial processes. And so we don't comment on ongoing legal processes, but we very much support the impartial and independent role that the court plays, and it plays an extremely important role. To turn to the questions from Deputy Clark, what does accountability and human rights look like? And thank you for the question, Deputy Clark. Again, I come back to the point on international law and respect for international conventions, and that's always Ireland's starting point. As a small state, we very much depend on those mechanisms ourselves, and that's our starting point across the board. You'll have seen at the March session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva that Ireland played a very active role in the Human Rights Council, including through the various agenda items relating to the OPT, and we work very closely, obviously, with EU partners on the ground there as well. In addition, we very much look at the role of civil society as a partner on human rights and accountability, and as Phelim mentioned, there is both a funding mechanism within the Irish Aid programme in Palestine to support the role of civil society. We would have concerns about the pressure put on civil society and on civil society space. So we do both fund civil society, but we also advocate for the importance of the role of civil society. We do that directly on the ground in the OPT and in Israel, and we also do it in Geneva and New York and in Brussels as well. And that to us is extremely important, and they're an extremely important partner in terms of accountability. So both the multilateral framework and the partnership with civil society is extremely important to us in that respect. The question on what does a viable Palestinian state look like, and thank you again for that. Again, I set out at the start Ireland's vision, which is very much based on internationally agreed parameters and on the 1967 borders, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. I suppose the key issue and the reason that the committee is looking at this report is because that is under threat, and I suppose the actions of the Israeli government in expanding settlements and in undertaking demolitions puts that under threat. For Ireland, we are supportive of a negotiated two-state solution, and that means both parties coming to the table and negotiating with the support of the international community. I know that the Minister is on the record as expressing his frustrations at the lack of process and the lack of political engagement around that, and Ireland has done everything within its power to try and advance that engagement, both through the EU, and obviously the EU as a member of the International Quartet on the MEP, and more broadly. And I think we have been very frustrated around that. And I think, when we look at the example from our own peace process, which the Minister draws on very much so in his engagement, it is very frustrating to see the lack of progress there. But that doesn't mean that Ireland doesn't continue to engage in that and to support that process, including in respect of through funding for organisations which contribute to the debate around that, and also take lessons from our own peace process on the island of Ireland as well, and contribute at that level as well. But the fundamental point, and I think the Deputy will agree, I hope, is the threat to the viability of a future Palestinian state obviously is undermined when we see settlements and when we see threatened evictions and settlements, and that is a very valid and a very important point. I think I have answered all the questions. If there's anything else that we didn't cover, please do feel free to come back to us.
I'm now reverting back to the committee, commencing with Deputy Stanton. Deputy David Stanton, thank you.
Thanks, Chairman. I'll be very brief. Again, welcome our guests here today. I note there from your statement that you said that 40% of the population is under 14. Now in Ireland, I think it's 21% is under 14, so that's extraordinarily high. Do we know, are there any particular reasons for that? Have the adults left, or why is that the case? It's extraordinarily high in my view. You also mentioned that you're working with some Israeli NGOs. Maybe you might say a little bit more about that. I'm sure I'm right in saying that not everyone in Israel agrees with what's happening with the demolitions and the forced moves of people and so forth. So you might say a little bit about the other side of Israel, and that other people in there that we know of that are opposed to this, and the NGOs you're working with. You also mentioned there are 5.7 refugees in Jordan, Syria and Lebanon. Now, I take it that many of those would be Syrian refugees from that other awful conflict across the border, and how many of those would be Palestinians that we know. And finally, you mentioned, and you can correct me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, I'm sure I am, Pegasus, the EU funds mechanism, that we contribute to that. You might say a little bit more about how much we actually contribute to that particular fund mechanism and the work that it does. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have anybody offering. Deputy Brady, would you like a minute or two before I revert back to our witnesses, to our guests?
Well, just to go back to the point there around the compensation claims that I know our witnesses said, it's primarily around the compensation claim through the West Bank Protection Consortium. Now, it was said that, look, we raised concerns when we engaged with the Israeli ambassador. Now, the West Bank Protection Consortium only look at, I suppose, projects in which they have, managed or put on the ground. And we know Ireland, we only gave them, was it last year or this year, 200,000. So it's only a small fraction of the Irish aid that goes into the occupied territories. Now, it's unfortunately not the only aid that is being destroyed by Israel. So the question there was for a broader picture of Irish aid that is being destroyed, has been destroyed by Israel. Can we get a picture of what that looks like? Because our previous witnesses have said that, I think it was over the last 5 years, I think they've put a value of 750,000 euros worth of aid that they have managed has been destroyed. Can we get a picture of Irish aid in its totality that has been destroyed by Israel, to make it easier, over the last 5-year period, not just in the occupied West Bank, but also in Gaza as well. And then what next step? Once we've identified, put a cost on the destroyed aid, what next steps have happened? It has been suggested that we engage with the Israeli authorities. If that is the case, what compensation, if any, has been paid to Irish aid? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Going back to our witnesses, Mr. McLaughlin or Ms. Moran, whichever you deem appropriate to deal with the questions as outstanding. Mr. McLaughlin, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just with respect to the high percentage of the youth population, I have to confess I don't know the particular reasons for that. So if I manage to find out, Deputy, I'll be happy to come back to you in writing. Just in terms of the refugees elsewhere, in fact, that refers to Palestine refugees who would be the descendants of people who were displaced. So, UNRWA, for example, works in Gaza, but it also has operations in those other countries, in Syria and in Lebanon in particular. But in fact, there's a very large percentage of the resident population of Lebanon, for example, which is of Palestinian descent and are refugees. In terms of Pegaz, Pegaz is a mechanism that is run by the European Commission. It is something that we've worked on and off with over a long number of years. We've provided funding with them, I think, in the past. It's something that I think maybe a total of 15.5 million over a number of years we provided to them. Last year, we provided them with €1 million. The way that it works is that it provides, I suppose, in a sense, income support and some kind of sort of basic payment to families who don't have any other means of support in many cases. And so it's a way of, I suppose, providing them with some sort of a subvention. And so particularly in the context of the COVID pandemic last year, we thought it was an important vehicle to work with. In terms of the broader question on demolitions that Deputy Brady raised, as I set out, the vast majority of what we do and the vast majority of places where we invest our money is really in the area of human capital. And we invest very much in the people of Palestine, in their education, and in the vindication of their human rights. Infrastructural development in that sense is not something that we have invested heavily in the past. So it's very difficult to put a figure, because, as I say, it's not an area that we would generally work in. Also, just in terms of structures built by the West Bank Consortium and other organisations, it's very difficult to put a figure as to which percentage of which donors' funding went into it. And I think the figure that our colleague gave earlier was that they've had a total of, I think, maybe €50 million in contributions from countries from the European Union since 2017. Ireland has contributed maybe €1 million of that. But again, that funding goes to legal aid. It goes to a whole series of different areas, and not just the construction of structures. So it's very, very difficult to put a figure and to extract a figure in that way. Maybe if I could pass on to Coit, I think who's going to pick up on a couple of the other points.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the questions, Deputy Stanton and Deputy Brady. So the question, Deputy Stanton, on funding for NGOs, yes, there is funding for both Israeli NGOs and Palestinian NGOs through the programme, and obviously also there are through the Irish Aid Civil Society Fund, which is managed from headquarters. We would be aware that Irish Civil Society will have partners directly on the ground where they will work with local NGOs, and that is very much part of the model of support and supporting local capacity and local NGOs. as part of that that support, there is a provision for families who are under threat of eviction for legal advice and support, and so that's very much something that is supported through the programme and through the support of the West Bank Protection Consortium, so that families who are under those threats do have access to both advocacy and legal advice under the programme. I think Phelim has touched on the point of Palestinian refugees, and I think one of the issues that we're very conscious of at the moment is just the vast spread of Palestine refugees throughout the region, and the work and the support provided by neighbouring countries in that respect as well, particularly countries like Jordan and like Lebanon and others who are very supportive of those communities in the region as well. And I suppose just to say that, across the board, in terms of our approach, we would always work with other donors, working very closely with the European Union, but also supporting the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in its role as humanitarian coordinator on the ground, and supporting the role of the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy on the Middle East Peace Process, who took up post recently in February as well. So all of those mechanisms are really important, and the role of those offices is also to engage with both the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government on those issues, both in terms of humanitarian funding, access for humanitarian assistance, protection of it, and also in respect, obviously, of the wider issues then around the peace process as well, which is obviously difficult to look at in the current context when we see what's going on, but that is very much part of the approach as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moran. Just on a point that you mentioned earlier in terms of the legal advice, I probably should have addressed this question at members of the consortium. Not sure to which yourself or Mr. McLaughlin can deal with just a rather technical issue, but we heard last week, and this is in relation to the legal advice that's given to people who may be subject to a demolition order or indeed an eviction order. But we heard last week in relation to East Jerusalem, which I suppose is the most recent or most topical area where evictions have given rise to probably violence. But we heard from international lawyer Natasha Hausdorff, who was very unambiguous when she stated that the title to the lands in East Jerusalem was never actually given by the Jordanians to the Palestinians. Now, how does that tally with the legal advice that members of the consortium or other human rights agencies or organisations would give to people in East Jerusalem in particular, or have the courts on any occasion sided with the Palestinians? Are we dealing with planning law, or are we dealing with strict conveyancing? I'm not sure the extent of which your experience would deal with that, but it strikes me from listening to people last week that this is an open and shut case, and that there should never be any dispute as to title within East Jerusalem. And nevertheless, our earlier speakers, and indeed yourself, Ms. Moran, has mentioned the importance of the legal advice. So is it more than just an exercise in futility?
Thank you, Chair, and happy to take that question. I may not have the details in terms of the title to the properties, but we can certainly, provide follow-up information to the committee on that. I think the importance of providing legal advice is to really support the families who are threatened in these situations, so that they can have access to legal processes, and I suppose bearing in mind very basic things like access to funds for that kind of legal advice, so to ensure that advice is there and that it goes, if there is a route through the court for it. Obviously, Ireland's position, as I mentioned, is based on international law, and that would be the primacy that we would attach to the situation. I think, the fact is, without having a detailed knowledge of the title issues and the land issues around it, I think the general point that we would make is that those families have been in residence in those homes for an extended period of time, and it is extremely harsh, to say the least, that they face this level of threatened eviction and this level of intimidation. Let's be frank. And I think we can see the wider impacts in that, as the Minister has set out in his statements to the Seanad also, in terms of the situation on the ground and the tensions that we have seen in East Jerusalem in the last recent weeks as well. But certainly the role of the support through the consortium is to ensure that that those who need it have access to the proper legal advice in those processes. But very happy, Chair, to come back with any further information that we can get for the committee on that.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time. I don't see members offering. Maybe I'd ask Mr. McLaughlin and Ms. Moore maybe for a final minute each in terms of the messaging to our committee. And I thank you very much for your engagement and for dealing with the questions and issues. And let me also avail of the opportunity of thanking both of you and your colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs for the manner in which this committee is briefed and for the very strong relationship between the Department and our committee, which is very much appreciated by all our members. So maybe a closing comment from Mr. McLaughlin and then a closing comment from Coach Moore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I suppose really just to go back to the point of departure that I think very much the RHA programme with respect to the Palestinian people is a blend of managing the humanitarian situation on the ground, responding to emergencies, but also really looking to the long term and trying to build the level of capacity that will be necessary for a viable Palestinian state into the future. And that is very much at the centre of the way that we work. Really, there is a very strong focus on that whole state building. Obviously, a country the size of Ireland can't do everything, so education is the area where we've decided to put our focus, and it's something that we have been focused on for many years. And it really is, I suppose, it underlines the importance that we attach to a viable Palestinian state and a two-state solution in the longer term. With the combination of support for UNRWA, for long-term Palestinian refugees, both in Gaza and elsewhere in the region, and the provision of humanitarian relief. So it's, as I say, it's a blended approach, very much of that mix of dealing with short-term, immediate, ongoing needs, and a state-building focus as well, with a much more long-term focus. Maybe Coit, if you wanted to.
Thank you. Ms. Moore, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I think just to echo the point that Phelim has made, where we started out in terms of the political lens that we look at the situation on the ground with, and that overall objective of supporting the resolution of the conflict. And I know that is difficult to look at in the week that we've seen. And the Minister has been very clear and very vocal on that, and will do so at the Foreign Affairs Council also this afternoon, which is in session at the moment as well, and will do so throughout the week. We'll see later on in the week a session of the UN General Assembly has now been called also. There are other upcoming events. So I suppose just to thank the members of the committee for their time and the invitation to come and brief you. And if there's anything that we can do by way of follow-up, we're only too happy to come back on any points raised. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, members and witnesses. That concludes our session this afternoon. We stand adjourned until a private meeting at 11:30 a.m. on Thursday. So thank you, members.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.